Thank you. Thanks. So, hi everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to my presentation. So I will eventually probably ask like whether you can see my screen. Here we go. Cool. All right, and everybody can see that. I got the chat open, so feel free to ping in there if need be.
Looks great. The other thing too, before you get started, David, we'll have everyone mute really quickly if you haven't already. Thank you.
Cool. All right, so from here, we're gonna go ahead and present. All right. So a lot of kind of this presentation is gonna go on more of just kind of the underpinnings of like what different kind of cybersecurity incidents have looked like. First, a little bit of background on like why a press freedom organization is even involved with this to begin with. So at Freedom of the Press Foundation, we're a small nonprofit that originally actually started at a conference room at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 2012, spun off into its own thing, and now we deal with, you know, kind of technology issues and other issues around press freedom. So we, as part of that, we have a digital security team led by Harlow Holmes. And then with my colleagues, Olivia and Martin, we basically help journalists not get hacked essentially and write guides on digital security that covers everything from like, you know, encrypting video footage, which is like some of the examples you see here, and, you know, how to use 2FA and like smartphone security and other stuff. We're also unique in that we also are the open source maintainers for SecureDrop. SecureDrop was originally an open source project created by the late Aaron Schwartz, designed as a platform that allows whistleblowers to securely leak to the press. It's used by a bunch of different newsrooms across the world, including some of the ones here, although we've expanded quite a bit since this list, so there's actually quite a bit more. More recently, we created a project in partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists called the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. This is essentially a way to create a, you know, paper of record, so to speak, on attacks on the press in the U.S. since the beginning of the Trump administration. This team has been extremely busy lately, so this has been kind of a thing that people have been using a lot lately and referencing a lot in order to like kind of figure out, keep track of the kind of fact finding around what's happening on the ground right now. A little bit about myself. So I'm a digital security trainer at FPF, used to be a tech resident at Pioneer Works, used to work at an AI lab, and then also used to be the lead developer at the Brooklyn Museum, where we created the mobile app there. Cool. So every single conversation that we have with journalists in this case begins with this idea of, you know, modeling risk. So in this case, sometimes thinking about that in terms of, you know, the information security verbiage of threat modeling, for example. And that kind of boils down to a few different questions. Thinking about, you know, what do I have to protect? In this case, journalism entails a lot of confidentiality in their day-to-day work in terms of talking to sources, making sure that their identity is secured to whatever, you know, level of confidentiality they promised essentially. But also thinking about reputation and how, you know, what does it look like if the Syrian Electronic Army decides to take over your homepage for a day because somebody had a bad WordPress password? That's, you know, a few other things to think about that are not necessarily as tangible as kind of the things that everybody thinks about. People think about, oh, I don't want hackers in my bank account. But beyond that, there's a lot of other damage can be inflicted just based on the reality that most of, you know, our existence is mediated through some kind of electronic medium, especially now that we're all basically communicating each other almost exclusively through screens. Of course, you know, going back to the second question, you know, mention a little bit about one potential adversary, but this can vary a lot based on the geopolitical context that you're in, or even just like whether or not your, you know, attack surface is so unsecure that, you know, this is just that you could be, you know, essentially a drive-by incident in an automated attack that had no intention of attacking you specifically. So this, you know, can include a pantheon of different people as we're looking at how journalists can protect themselves during protests from police surveillance, for example. We talk a lot about you know, modeling the risks around, you know, what kind of surveillance powers do police departments have, for example. And, you know, as we look at protests elsewhere in the world, like, you know, what does it mean to protest in Hong Kong, for example, when you have one of the most powerful cyber powers on earth uh, at the disposal of your opposition? Things can get, you know, sometimes very kind of like easy to handle to, you know, full Snowden level kind of threat models. And then, of course, there's resources. You know, going back to what I mentioned, like some uh, potential adversaries will have more resources than others, depending on, like, you know, a few different things based on, you know, how much money do they have to spend on getting into you, uh, to all the way to, like, what is their technical expertise, what kind of legal avenues do they have at their disposal. Then, of course, there's likelihood. Again, this is something that's hard to predict because you never know when something you might report on will unleash all the haters. And that's, you know, the unfortunate reality of where a lot of different things in journalism are. That being said, though, you know, somebody reporting on police brutality is going to get a lot more attention than somebody, you know, reporting the weather, for example, in terms of like potential adversaries. And then, of course, there's this idea of ability. And that's like essentially how far will I, as a journalist, be able to go to protect my own assets. And this can mean a few different things. In many ways, like this is kind of an equation of time, money, technical skill, both on the side of you and your potential adversaries. Journalists generally don't have a lot of time. They also don't have a lot of money. But the one thing that like all of us as human beings can work on is, you know, our skills. In this case, our brain is, you know, squishy neural network that is essentially an infinite resource that we can just build on forever. So we're going to do a little bit about today. So going into, you know, how do people actually get hacked? There's, you know, in addition to kind of the, you know, things that I've seen firsthand as we've kind of become sort of the team that sometimes gets drop shipped into newsrooms after an incident has happened. There's a lot of real world examples that we can kind of look at to get an idea of like how these things could have been prevented. So Mark Zuckerberg, total, you know, billionaire, like basically hella money, hella technical skill, pretty high rated and top coder, got hacked. So you would think, man, if somebody hacked Zuck, they must have had extremely high time, technical skill, and resources. This must have been like the most advanced, you know, hardcore, like, you know, beyond NSA and Beijing and Tel Aviv powers. Like, what is going on here? Let's take a pop quiz. So I'm going to move this chat window out of the way because it's here. So in the chat, feel free to chime in which of these quiz. This is a pop quiz. So feel free to chime in on which of these were kind of the way that Zuck got popped. Option A, those meddling Winklevoss twins, up to no good. Option B, his RFID wallet didn't have, or his wallet didn't have one of the, it wasn't the RFID blocking kind. Option C, not unique password. You know, that's unfortunately a common thing for many people. And then option D, charging his phone with a hacked USB charger. All right, so I see 2 C's, 1 D, 2 C, 2 more C's. Okay, cool. All right, well, y'all were like basically on the right track. So this, in this case, was a issue with a non-unique password. Let's see. Yep. Yeah, so there was like a password that was reused. And yeah, it was basically from there, somebody was able to say, hey, somebody's using this password in this account. Maybe they're using it in another one. Okay, so this was a really big story back in the day. That was a big deal for everybody except me because all my friends were in the Northeast and were affected by this massive outage, but because the like CDNs or whatever configuration basically were regionally distributed, I was in Phoenix in late 2016 and I was like, I don't know what you all are talking about. I'm on GitHub right now, it's fine. But this was a huge DDoS attack in this case that was leveraged against DIN, which does a lot of DNS domain level stuff to basically make it so that, you know, if you, like GitHub technically wasn't down, it was, you know, if you went to GitHub by knowing one of its load balancer's IP address, I guess you can get to it. But otherwise, you know, unavailable for the way most people connect to it. All right, so another pop quiz. How do you think this massive, huge, like take down a good chunk of, you know, the North American internet went? Was it a slightly less expensive firewall, the ones that you're always being shown ads for at the airport? Was it B, a non-unique password? Was it C, hardware implants the size of a grain of rice implanted by the Chinese government? Or was it D, was it literally just Vladimir Putin himself, just like tossing back Code Red Mountain Dew and hacking the Matrix? All right, let's see. We got A, C, B, B, B. Cool. And another B. Well, I think y'all probably noticed the pattern I've done by now, so I'll probably speed through the next one. But yeah, in this case, this was made possible by a few different moving parts. In this case, there are botnets. These are essentially computers that have been hijacked to use their collective power to build a distributed, like, large computer, essentially. Kind of like what you would see with, you know, folding at home screensaver, but in this case used for cyber attacks. In this case, you know, a lot of the IT devices that were affected did not have their default username and password changed, and these were exposed to the open internet in this case, and were leveraged for this attack. So a few different moving parts, but this was kind of a key component in it. Of course, there's kind of a newer one. There's, you know, these Ring cameras, you know, that Amazon's created. Amazon, of course, is very big, is not just kind of creating random cheap set-top boxes. They have a world-class security team. You know, they have their own Linux distribution. Like, they have the technical skill to create things that are secure. So how did something like this happen? Oh, and of course, you know, if you haven't seen the stories about it, it's like pretty spooky. Let's see. So pop quiz. Was it A, hacking the owner's Wi-Fi network? So much fixation in the information security world around Wi-Fi networks. Was it advanced NSO Q group weapons like Pegasus? For anyone not familiar, these are basically weaponized ODAs that are used by intelligence agencies mostly to break into people's phones. Was it C, viruses on the camera owner's computer? Or was it D, non-unique password? Yep. So I'm just gonna go, yeah, y'all know this by now. Non-unique password. In this case, and also no two-factor authentication, which we'll go into what that is in a little bit. Yeah, so in this case, it's kind of the same kind of issues I had. People were able to look at leaked passwords from other breaches and correlate those with the accounts that were used to register with the Ring account and kind of go from there. This is also like relatively cheap. So as far as like, you know, how advanced of an adversary you need to worry about, it's not that advanced. All right, so here's the dilemma though. You know, passwords created essentially as a workaround. You'd be like, well, we need some way to restrict access on multi-user systems. How do we do that? Oh, I guess like a passcode. And then that was just kind of like thrown in without any human-computer interface user experience research involved whatsoever. So people just kind of went with it. And for a while, you know, people didn't have too many things they had to remember that were secret, in terms of like codes anyway. So this worked, so to speak, in some ways. But over time, you know, a lot of people have been online for a long time. You know, we have so many things that we have a separate online account for. And we are all basically being asked to memorize what are now hundreds of passwords. And to do that securely, every one of them would need to be unique. So that, of course, you know, creates some new problems and some like limitations on how much our, you know, squishy neural network can actually hold realistically. But, you know, the whole point of computers in this case, at least in my philosophy, is to make technology do the work that is boring and annoying that humans don't want to do. So yeah. Oh yeah, and as far as, so this is a good question. So as far as like the practicality of having the security, the practicality is in this case essentially being able to offload, having to memorize things into something to remember them for you. So that is a good segue into how to do that. So password managers are, software tools you can use that will let you securely store and generate actually passwords that are unique, random, and long. So we'll go into like the characteristics of that and like why that actually matters. And by the way, it's okay. Like feel free to like send questions in the chat, and I'll like, I'm used to kind of like sort of in-person kind of Socratic method, what do you think about this? And like, hey, what about this? So yeah, the back and forth is totally cool. So yeah, 1Password definitely looks like we have some fans, which is great. I'm a fan of it as well. So we have a few different options that we kind of like talking about at FPF, and mostly because most journalists work within teams. 1Password and LastPass have been good at having secure means of like sharing passwords with each other. That being said, for certain situations where we're dealing with something like secure drop, for example, which involves at the very end of a process a computer that has not touched the internet, we can't, of course, do a internet connected password manager. So that's where, certain password managers that have the flexibility of working offline come into play. KeePass XC is an example of that. It's not the most user-friendly system on the planet, but it sort of works and gives, a certain amount of flexibility on like choosing like where to store a password database, being able to like have like a few different options set up in terms of like whether you want to store this offline or in a separate encrypted volume that's different from the actual volume that the software is installed on, for example. Of course, this still has one requirement for a password, and that is the password for the password manager. So this is particularly important to make a secure password because of the fact that, if you have this one password, you have all the passwords to some degree. For any of you that have, migrated devices on 1Password, for example, you know that you have to do a little bit more than that. And there's like a secret key and like a few other steps involved to help protect you a little bit more. But generally speaking, you want to make sure that this like one main password, the password manager password, is one that is particularly secure. So the way we do that in this case for human memorable passwords is using a passphrase instead of a password. So something like an 8-letter password, for example, a popular thing on the internet because a lot of the rules of what we have for passwords now were essentially just kind of passed on from what made sense in the 90s. Having a short password based on like the limitations of databases at the time to hold certain data types, and then seeing like, well, you can throw in some numbers and symbols, but not these symbols because our database can't support it. And unfortunately, that in the modern age makes it a little bit more crackable. Versus if you look at something where length is taken into play, that equation changes significantly, pretty drastically. So this is an example of a password checker. Don't actually put your real password into this, also because, people have trust issues with Kaspersky, and we don't know whether to trust them or not, and you can read all about all the different theories around that. But essentially you have, one of the most common passwords ever, password 123, crackable in 6 seconds through a blind brute force attack where a computer would just random, and this is like using a 2015 MacBook Pro as an example, where it would just guess every possible combination of letters and numbers in this case for this length. If you make it quite a bit longer though, because the amount of permutations possible for a longer string essentially grows exponentially with each character that you add. And that basically has this kind of nice, essentially like hockey stick effect, where the computing power that you would need to crack a password like this, not this passphrase, because this is literally correct battery horse staple, is like the example that everybody talking about password uses when they talk about this stuff. But the length in this case is kind of its strongest asset. But that's not all there is to it. So in this case, the amount of time that people have spent on the internet adds, the time and increases, in this case, the probability that they may themselves have had one of their passwords breached at some point. So I'm going to exit out of the presentation for a little bit and go over to one example of what this would look like. So Have I Been Pwned is a website ran by an independent researcher named Troy Hunt. And what this does is it basically collects all these breached passwords that you buy on like shady websites, and then just uses it to see whether your email address is included in terms of like one of these hacks. So if I go to a relatively new email address, there's probably not going to be too much there yet. Whereas if I go into email addresses that have been around for a very long time, this is like back when Gmail was an invite only, you can tell like there's been a few breaches since then that my account has been in. Of course, I've like reset my password since all these happened, but this will give you a good idea on like which passwords to change right away. The other thing too is you have essentially a nice list to work with if you want to research these, where you can basically essentially download the list or hashes in this case of the passwords that that have been leaked in different links, but without the email address associated with them. So in this case, like you don't want to it's a little bit unethical to just kind of like show what every single person's password is with them, like David's word password for Gmail was this. But in this case, just showing like the list overall passwords like anonymized from the original account holder. In this case, this is useful because then you can use this to accelerate an attack that would otherwise take 6 seconds into something much faster. So most kind of Hollywood ideas of what this kind of password cracking look like is, you see somebody with like a login screen and there's like, the form is right there and they're just like going through all of them somehow really quick. And then it's like turns green and hacked. The reality is a little bit less exciting, but it still looks pretty cyberpunk, I think, in my opinion. So this is what like a data breach looks like, essentially. So these are, in this case, a sampling of 100 passwords from a hashed database. So most modern web applications and like most modern like database applications have the ability to what is called hash and salt passwords. So essentially, you wouldn't actually store, unless you're Sony, which if you read anything about their breaches, they have not, I don't think, fixed this, where they're just like, oh yeah, let's store password 123 in plain text in our database. Most, modern systems for creating applications, web applications especially, will have like a better way to approach this. Django, Ruby on Rails, for example, if you has, the plugins that are available for user management will generally have some way to like hash and salt these the passwords so that they're not stored in plain text in your database. That being said, so that kind of like the challenge in this case goes to cracking hashes. So that's like what it actually means to crack a password in this case, to basically convert this like fixed length hash, mathematical hash of a password, back to its original string. So the way to do that is essentially to use a tool like Hashcat. So this is a tool that's done for security research. There's a newer one out, but like my NVIDIA driver is like garbage, so I can't actually use it right now. So this is a slightly old version from last year, but it basically does the trick. So in this case, it runs on Linux, but I think also macOS and a few other operating systems. But you basically have some parameters to say, specify like the output, a range. So in this case, we're taking like 100 hashes from this text, and we're basically comparing them against what is called the RockU database list. So I think you can also get this from Troy Hunt's website, but essentially you have this like list of 10 million, I want to say, known passwords that have been found through data breaches, and basically run it through that. So you don't have to actually go through each and every possible string to get to a certain hash. You can basically just see if any of the hashes essentially match one of the words that's in a list. So if it's not salted and in some cases peppered, which Ruby on Rails has a way to do that, that makes it significantly difficult to crack, which is cool. Let's go ahead and run this and see how long it takes. Yep, it's done. Cool. Well, that was pretty quick. So if we look at more cracked.txt, you can kind of see, so in this case, you have the hash on one side and you have the like cracked password on the other. So these are very common passwords, unfortunately, and tend to get reused a lot because I think people have a lot of mythologies about how these kind of things work behind the scenes. Like people maybe don't understand that, even though it matches the requirements of their, company policy for their SharePoint account or whatever, hey, it's 6 digits and it has numbers and letters, that doesn't really help you if it's ABCD TY123. So, so with salted, it's basically, if I recall correctly, that's taking another value that is stored in the database. So it's basically saying like you basically add a string that is prepended or appended to the original string password. And then it just knows to say like, hey, this is salted with this, so that the password, the hash wouldn't just be the password. It would be, a special string plus the password. Peppered actually is like something else where it does the same thing, but in this case, it uses, if I recall correctly, a separate file that is actually really hard to maintain, and people have been bitten by this. In Ruby on Rails, for example, there is a way to have a pepper with the, I can't believe I'm blanking out on, not Bitwarden, the user management thing that everybody uses has like a config file, and you can specify a file as a pepper file, but it's not it's not something you want to commit into your Git repo, so you have to like know to deploy it into your production environment and know to like have a backup copy. Otherwise, people have lost it and have made it so that people get locked out of their accounts essentially. So there is some management involved with peppering database sets, but then with that, like it makes it harder to get into because in this case, like thinking about how breaches happens, there's normally separate decoupled systems for databases and web servers to some degree. So like you might in a modern architecture have a database server that exists somewhere else and in one place and a web server that exists in another place. So somebody wanting to get to that password would have had to also breach the web server holding the pepper file in addition to the database file holding the salt value and the hashes. So that's why it makes it significantly difficult for an adversary to be able to, do a breach on your users that way, which is good news. Anyway, so that is an example of what that looks like. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to presentation. All right. So in terms of like, how do we help our users create better passwords? Now that we know that password managers are probably good, how do we encourage users to create strong passwords so that they don't end up in this trap of creating passwords that that they might think are secure but actually are not? So there's a few people doing like really amazing work around this. Carnegie Mellon University is one of them. They are putting a ton of research into the usability of technology and security, and thinking about how to create strong passwords is like one aspect of that. So this is a thing that they have that you can actually include into your own project. So in this case, it's the Cups Lab Password Meter. It is, it was a collaborative project with the University of Chicago. There's code available on GitHub if you want to check it out, so you can see like what that looks like. There's also, so this actually like a little bit of this actually just changed probably yesterday because of WWDC. But there are ways of including support for 1Password using their API into your iPhone apps in this case, which is great. Slack, of course, is like one example you can see here that does this, which lets you basically let your users fill in passwords easily. iOS just dropped a feature, like basically, I just found out about yesterday, where they will basically have an integration with their built-in keychain support that will do a few extra things. It will check to see whether the password that you're using has been in a breach, and will also let users essentially have their password filled in for them. And you can actually set up the backend of your app's API to have this like handshake exchange with your iPhone app, so that you can basically have essentially a passwordless login, where the user just basically says like, yep, it's me, here's my keychain entry. And then like one button, bam, there's like, you know, some API calls that happen in the background. And then you're basically in. So that's kind of where where like at least the iOS land future is heading, which is interesting. So GDPR has helped kind of like, you know, sort of instigate people into instigate companies into sharing when they've been breached. But there's always a possibility that, you know, there might be a breach that even the company, you know, with your data doesn't actually know about yet. Sometimes, and this is like a lot of security researchers will sometimes find out about these things based on what's being traded on different sort of like shady, sort of like black market, sort of underground Bitcoin-y websites. And, you know, in this case, that and phishing are unfortunately a way that an adversary would still be able to get a hold of your very secure password. So as a way to buttress against that kind of attack, there is what is called two-factor authentication. In security, there's this like kind of like three-sphere idea of what authentication is. So in this case, the first factor is something that you know. So this could be a password or a passphrase that you use to unlock the password manager that you can then use to get into your password. Something that you have, so something that you physically possess on your person, which can mean something like your phone, for example, or one of these kind of like WebAuthn keys, which we'll get into in a little bit. And, you know, the third factor we don't really talk about too much, because it's a fairly nascent technology, but it's becoming more ubiquitous now, just something that you are. And that gets into things like biometrics, things like, you know, face recognition in Windows Hello, or with iOS's built-in face authentication. So this is something that has to be set up on the end of the provider, which means that not all providers will have it. And one way to look up whether the services that we use actually have two-factor authentication is using, in this case, this website is really handy, twofactorauth.org. It will let you search for whatever service you might have. So you can type in like Adobe or Gmail or whatever, Dropbox, and then have it show like the different kinds of two-factor authentication that they support. So not all of them, not all these methods are the same, and not all of them have equal levels of security. So SMS in this case is text messages. So in this case, just plain old phone text messages that have been around since like, you know, the Nokia 3310. Phone calls, same idea, just plain old phone calls. Email, of course, we know, and then hardware and software tokens we'll get into. The problem with text message or SMS-based two-factor authentication is that it depends largely on the security of your phone number. And this is a problem because, you know, if your password gets phished and then somebody impersonates you well enough to have your phone number ported to their phone number, then they can essentially take over your account, even with two-factor authentication. This happened in 2016 to DeRay McKesson, Black Lives Matter activists. And this involved like two different things. So like the password was breached somehow, either through phishing or password reuse, I don't really know. And in this case, Verizon was social engineered, as we would say, into giving an attacker DeRay's phone number. So this is actually worse in other countries. So the good news in the US is that, like, as scary as it sounds, like, sometimes certain cyber attacks are quote unquote easy, but incredibly difficult to get away with. This is one of them. Everybody involved in this case, it's like been in front of a judge. A lot of similar cases have happened with cryptocurrency holders, people wanting to get into those like big Bitcoins. And yeah, people are like, they're in court or in jail. So it's not something that, you know, on paper, like, yes, this is like something like really scary, but the reality is that like, it's very difficult to get away with something like this in the US. In other countries, you know, things matter, and this is why a lot of these things are very, you know, context specific. Australia, for example, this kind of account hijacking happens like all the time. And it's just like a normal thing. So that's just something that I learned when I was down there last year. So what if we don't want to have to depend on the security of our mobile carrier and have to worry about, you know, teenagers at a mall kiosk having enough security savvy to prevent, you know, random people from being able to hijack my phone number? That's where we would use a software app to generate the codes in the device. And instead of having to like transmit it to us over the phone system via text messages to our phone number. So Authy is one way to do this. This is an app created by Twilio. It needs an internet connection, so there is some limitations on how you can use it. If you're traveling, for example, it might not be the best bet if you don't have, you know, a data plan in that country. That being said, it's free, and there are ways to sort of encrypt the backup codes that you create for all these accounts in a way that's similar to a password manager. So if you create a encrypted backup thing, I forget what they actually call it, you can basically have a secure way to store your 2FA credentials on their server, and then you know, bring those back to whatever new device you migrate to. This is not the case, by the way, with Google Authenticator, which will absolutely forget every single password because it stores it locally on the device, and will actually make it so that it can't be included in a backup of your device. So I did this recently, or I tested this recently on my iPhone, where I upgraded to a newer iPhone. And yeah, of course, Authy, because, you know, these things are stored in the server, was able to get those credentials back in. Google Authenticator, nope. But if you do want something that's kind of a good balance of the two, FreeOTP is an open source version of something like Google Authenticator that will allow you to use it offline, and also allow you to have those like codes included in a backup without having to sync to a third-party service like Authy's. So there's a few different options in that area. So the favorite thing in the world that I love recommending and like give out like candy to journalists is the security keys. And we'll get into why, but essentially they are these like physical tokens that in this case are separate from your phone number, separate from your phone altogether, and can be used to log into different accounts without even having to enter a code or unlock your phone and look for an app and open it up, look for a code, hope that you type it fast enough. In this case, this automates all that, going back to my philosophy of computers doing all the things you don't want to do, and lets you just kind of tap to log in after you enter a password in most cases. Some of them have different functionality as well. So if you use GitHub, you can store on the higher end ones, with smart card functionality, you can store things like SSH keys, GPG keys. We have a guide at freedom.press/training on generating GPG keys with smart cards. And, you know, they're USB in this kind of example, but there's also, you know, other ones that have some wireless functionality. Like this is a 510 key, which has NFC functionality. So if you have an Android device with NFC, you can use this as your 2FA token. What if it gets lost or stolen? So this is why I have like 5 of them. So in this case, what we generally recommend for a lot of journalists is basically having a few of these, and then possibly, depending on like what their situation is, having a mix of different options. So having both an authenticator app like Authy or FreeOTP, and then also having a key, and then maybe having a third backup key at home someplace. Just because like in this case, you know, what if you lose your phone? You still have your, you know, your security key. What if you lose your keys? You still have your phone. What if you lose both? Well, in that case, then you would have like a separate one that you keep in a safe someplace. And then you can revoke keys that you've lost from each service. That being said, though, the risk is minimal because in this case, for 2FA, for using a security key for 2FA, you would still need, in most services, the password to be able to like break into your account if somebody were to steal it from you. So there's still some like kind of extra padding security there, and like every service that I've used it with lets you revoke older keys that you no longer have in your possession, which is good. Then of course, you know, the kind of hardcore option is having only security keys, and there's a few specific reasons to do this. So Google Advanced Protection has a partnership with us that lets us distribute these to more high-risk journalists. And the way this works is this automatically configures your Google account to have absolutely no way to access the data, even through third-party plugin, except by going through one of these two keys. These are very standardized U2F WebAuthn keys, but in this case, there's a lot of extra settings that happen when you switch on advanced protection behind the scenes that like disable any other kind of 2FA. There's a few reasons for that. There's specific advanced adversaries that have been targeting human rights defenders and others that will actually anticipate that you have, you know, two-factor authentication set up with either a text message or a authenticator app, and will like use basically a headless browser to extract that code, copy that back to their backend, and then log in through an API essentially to get into your like Proton Mail account or whatever. That's like very rare, but that's something where that technology is already like, that kind of attack is already in the wild. So for that kind of people with that kind of advanced threat model, we recommend this. And one of the reasons for that is that it is essentially, for all intents and purposes, phishing proof. Google has done some extensive research on, you know, what works really well in different kinds of scenarios. And in many cases, like, you know, SMS works fine for a lot of things. You know, on-device prompts, which are, you know, something that iOS has had for a while and Android has as well, work relatively well. But security keys have this like perfect score. And the reason for that is that it actually, so the WebAuthn and U2F protocols work in such a way that when you log in with one of these security keys, security key will actually check the browser that it's talking to, check the TLS certificate for the website. So if it's google.com, it'll check to see whether the actual, you know, TLS certificate, the HTTPS part basically, matches the one that it was used to register with. And if it doesn't, it just doesn't release the key. Like literally the like TX line will not transmit the electrons to like transmit the code into the hardware of whatever you're logging into. And that's why this is like such a great defense against something like a phishing attack. So yeah, that's why it's got a perfect score. So there's a lot of accounts that we have to worry about. But if I had to, and this is something that you know, journalists have a limited amount of time. So I say like, hey, if you want to prioritize one account, make it for the email account that you register all the other accounts with, because that is the way you would get into everything else. Most websites, most services that we have a forgot my password feature. And if you take over the account that email, that I forgot my email password reset email goes to, you basically have the keys to the kingdom for any other account that you registered with that email address. Which is why, like, if you have one account to register with 2FA, definitely go for that. And definitely going for security keys or an authenticator app, because these things are generally safer than, more effective than SMS. There's also things like recovery codes. Most services that offer 2FA have a set of backup codes, or sometimes just one backup code. Like Twitter is kind of in the sense that they give you exactly one backup code, but you can use that if you're like completely locked out. Like if you're just like seriously like, I am like lost in the desert, so I don't have my phone, my keys, and I need to get into my account, a backup code printed in a piece of paper in your wallet, which hopefully you'd still have, would let you get back in essentially. And then of course, there's apps for multi-device. So thinking about how to share between teams. Sometimes it depends on like the budget basically. In larger teams where you're sharing an account, you can just basically set up multiple keys. Each person gets mailed the key and they could each log in that way. With authenticator apps, it gets a little bit tricky because in the setup process, you have to have a mathematical seed to transmit over the screen, in this case through QR code to your phone. And if the 20 other phones that need to see that QR code aren't there, that gets tricky. But if you take a photo of the QR code and send it to them over an app like Signal, which we'll get into, then that is like one way to do that. So there's an example of how to implement this with Node.js. If you want to have this available for your own users. U2F hardware gets a little bit tricky. WebAuthn is making it easier to implement because that's like a newer standard that's a little bit easier to include in modern applications. And then of course we're thinking of, let's kind of very quickly look at, mention TLS. What does that look like? Looking for HTTPS, because if you don't have HTTPS, people can see the entirety of what you're doing, including, a login page if you don't have a TLS certificate there. You can get them, you can check for them on your own browser using these plugins. This used to be an issue with news sites. Many of them did not have HTTPS, and that was a problem. So, now that's changed, and most websites in the US anyway have that, which is great. And if you want to have this to your own, add this to your own website, you can use what's called Let's Encrypt. And that is a free service that will let you have your own HTTPS certificate, your own TLS certificate that will let you have HTTPS on your website. Heroku also has this kind of built in, which is nice. And then thinking about, safer web browsing, what are some plugins to help block, ad tracking? And then of course some browsers, like for mobile, there's Brave browsers that'll let you do that, which is cool because that helps kind of mitigate or protect your privacy as you traverse the internet from ad surveillance. Then of course you're thinking about securing your communications. What FPF talk would not be complete with a talk about end-to-end encryption. So in this case, this is an example of what end-to-end encryption looks like. It is, this is an older thing called PGP. And this is what Google would see, which is basically not the message. A little bit about maybe the sender, the receiver, the time that it was sent, and the protocol that was used, but not the actual content, which is great. Modern version of this is Signal. We recommend this to journalists a lot, and a lot of them in the kind of Acela corridor of the kind of Boston, New York, Washington area use this now a lot. But we kind of recommend everybody use it. It's really great. It's encrypted, it's modern, it runs on Android and iOS. And kind of giving an idea of like where it stands in the spectrum of security, we have here, this kind of axis that we use of like, do people actually have it? Because you have to have it installed on both ends to be able to use it. And how good is its privacy? So it does high marks on super privacy preserving, not so much on whether it's used by a lot of people. That's slowly changing, but in terms of like why we trust it so much, it's been proven in court in this case. They were given a grand jury subpoena, asked to like fork over any and all data they had on the owner of a particular phone number because your Signal account is tied to your phone number. And in this case, they were able to show like the phone number's blacked out, but all the data that they had on this person, which in this case, the totality of the data that they had was the last connection date and the account created, in this case in Unix timestamp. WhatsApp, on the other hand, also end-to-end encrypted, uses actually the same protocol as Signal, but has some caveats. It is very easy to accidentally back things up to iCloud, and from there, thinking about our adversary as having, access through the legal system to getting to your data, that could be an issue. Facebook Messenger also has a similar end-encrypted feature, but only on the app and only if you go to secret chats, not regular kind of conversations. And then of course there's iMessage, technically end-to-end encrypted, questionable encryption, cipher choices, and no way to verify that the actual encryption key hasn't been tampered with. Signal has safety numbers, so does WhatsApp, and I think even Facebook Messenger has as well. And those let you see whether something changed, essentially. If somebody tried creating a new, private key that lets a third party read the contents or not, for example. Slack, on the other hand, has 0 end encryption. It doesn't bother to promise it because for them, this is like a thing that is a, encrypted to Slack servers, but that data sits readily accessible to Slack in Slack servers. And all right, so web security resources, thinking about what kind of things to look out for. You want to make sure to, in whatever infrastructure you're running, make sure that it's up to date. Security patches are very important. That is how security fixes get, released into the world. And those are kind of the ways to look at that. There's also like kind of mistakes that get repeated a lot, and these are what we call the OWASP top 10. Things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, etc. Definitely look out for those. And OWASP top 10, if you Google that, is like a really great resource for that. On kind of the red team side of things, if you want to actually learn kind of the offensive security side of this, you can, look into what are called capture the flag events. These are basically contests to see whether you and your team can break into a server that is set up as a capture the flag type system. Many of them have prizes. If nothing else, like it helps you kind of, practice your skills in this area and learn all kinds of cool new tools and things. So Pico CTF is great. There's Plaid CTF, which is kind of the Olympics of CTFs. Definitely check those out if you're interested in that. Cool. Anyway, so we're coming up on time, but I want to make sure that we have room for some like final questions. Oh, you're having a CTF by the end of July. Awesome. So that's really great. Yeah. Any questions? What do you think of DuckDuckGo? Oh, okay, cool. I like them. I like happen to be friends with some folks that work on stuff that they do. So I have a lot of good warm feelings for DuckDuckGo. They're really great in the sense that like they kind of knew that as they were seeing Google become ever more invasive, that there would be, our market for a search engine that didn't need to be. And it's really cool because like they have a very strong privacy policy. It's really readable. And yeah, they basically seem to collect very little data about you. They have a lot of cool features in their search tools. So if I want to do like a currency conversion, I can just, type in something like, €4 in USD, and then it'll give me a cool answer. Yeah, and if you're a developer and you want to like look at the source documentation or direct documentation of a programming language, there's, I forget what they're called, but you put an exclamation mark, language name, and then a search term, and it'll give you whatever the results are from the official like documentation for that language usually. They're pretty cool. Yep, I like DuckDuckGo. And their business model is interesting in that like their ads don't have to be targeted because there are some ads that are just like more worthwhile to have than others. And in this case, DuckDuckGo still knows your general location based on your IP address. So a lot of, from what I hear anyway, a lot of their kind of like bigger income winners are basically real estate ads, which you really don't need to know that much more of than, a location, or at least that's the most relevant aspect to targeting something like that. So, VPNs, yes. So there's a lot of feelings I have VPNs because they're very useful for some things and not that useful for most things. VPNs tend to be hyped as a way to protect yourself from your ISP and the Wi-Fi network, but the reality of what it means to use the internet in 2020 is very, very, very different from where things were in 2006. So actually, there is a great write-up on this. Or at least it was okay. I mean, Wired is another piece that I think better, but the essentially talks about the concerns and kind of fears people have around, oh no, if Wi-Fi gets hacked, what does that mean? And years and years and years ago, there was things like what was it called? Firesheep, that would let people read things like Facebook messages or other things based on cookie hijacking, because Facebook.com in 2006 had HTTPS for their login page, but not for like every aspect of their site. So some parts of it would still be open in the air, including some of the aspects that should have been to protect cookie hijacking. And what that allowed people to do is basically sit on a Wi-Fi network and like look at everybody's messages as they traverse through the network. This is no longer the case. Facebook is extremely well protected in terms of their TLS certificate. Same thing with most of the websites people use on a day-to-day basis. In 2006, people could get away with saying, like, if you get hacked in your Wi-Fi, people can read your email and see your messages. And blah, blah. That's not really the case anymore. Like, most of these websites have TLS installed in such a way that they're protected from things like DNS spoofing because of like modern browsers. They're protected from being able to regress to like weaker cipher suites. Things have gotten a lot better and the landscape has changed. What people can see though, your ISP, your Wi-Fi network, they can see what websites you're connecting to, which might in and of itself be a problem, depending on like what kind of situation you're in. But they are useful in certain cases if you want to get around a country censorship. If you have a great firewall type situation in China, for example, a good VPN will help you, escape that. Same thing with anonymity networks like Tor, for example. Where did the chat go? All right. Once I find the chat, I will be glad to answer any other questions you have.
And say I could, what was the last question that you remember, and I can read off the chat too.
Oh, that was about VPNs.
About what one?
VPNs, like if VPNs are overhyped.
Okay, so are VPNs overhyped, or can you be useful for privacy and security? That question?
Yeah.
Okay. The next one was, how secure is Tor browser, TOR?
Yeah, so Tor browser is neat. It's basically an anonymity network that was originally set up as this sort of way for, essentially originally, like, it was a US naval research project, so I think it was used as a way to like theoretically kind of thwart attribution in cyber attacks. Still kind of used for that. But in this case, it is very, very useful as a way to essentially use the internet anonymously. And by anonymously in this case, I mean anonymizing your IP address. So your IP address in this case being the sort of like phone number of the internet. So you have, your computer has a, internet connection from your ISP with an IP address issued to it. When you web connect to a website, you connect your, IP address connects to the IP address of whatever website that you're trying to connect to. And by doing that, that website knows what your IP address are. So this is why VPNs and Tor are useful for journalists, because in this case, if that IP address is associated with like a building like the New York Times, for example, a website that you're investigating would basically know that somebody at the New York Times is like digging around on their website, which has, caused issues in the past. Yeah. Tor helps basically do the same thing, but also makes it so that it's truly anonymous, so that VPN, for example, you still move the trust relationship from the internet service provider to the VPN provider, because the VPN provider still gets to see what your internet traffic is. With Tor, though, things are anonymized so that, we have this like volunteer network of like 5,000 machines that are distributed across mostly North America and Europe. But basically you have a random circuit of 3 computers. So you connect to the entry node, the middle node, and the exit node. Each of them is kind of optimized to be not owned by the same owner of the hardware. And each of them can only see different aspects of that connection. So you have the entry node can see your IP address and the IP address to send it to. So the middle node, it doesn't know what website you're trying to go to or what the exit node is going to be. The middle node cannot see what the original IP address is. It can see the middle node's IP address that it got sent the request from, and the next one to send it to, so the exit node. The exit node can only see the middle node that it got the request from and the final destination, but not where it came from before that. So there's a lot more to the heuristics of how Tor works and how it's optimized, pseudo-randomness on based on certain economic incentives to prevent certain kinds of attacks. But in a nutshell, that's essentially how Tor works to anonymize internet connections. Perfect. And it's useful. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's a great explanation. Sorry to cut you off.
Thank you. And it's useful for a lot of other things. SecureDrop, for example, takes advantage of what are called Tor hidden services or Tor onion services. The way those work is that it essentially makes it so that you have that kind of 3-hop thing happen both ways. So in addition to having anonymous users, you can also have an anonymous website that is like truly IP address anonymous. And it works in kind of the same way that people would do whistleblowing in like the 1960s, where, you would have a whistleblower, talk to you as a reporter and say like, you don't know where I'm going to be coming from. I don't know where you're going to be coming from, but we're going to meet inside this parking lot and talk about some Pentagon papers. That's kind of the same architecture where you have like a rendezvous point within the Tor network that is like randomly chosen within the circuit. And then you don't have an exit node at all. You have this like 3-hop system to a rendezvous point. The rendezvous point in this case only knows the last hop of it. And, the same hop system is worked on either side. And yeah, that's basically in a nutshell how SecureDrop works. There's a lot behind the scenes that goes on with it, but that's essentially how we can create an architecture that truly and holistically protects whistleblowers even in the most dangerous of situations.
The fellow that asked that question said thanks for the detailed explanation as well.
Cool.
The next question, we just have a couple more, even though we're a little over on time, is what do you think about DNS versus VPN?
So DNS, domain name services, so these are like, this is the way that the internet basically will essentially works. We have like what are called name servers, you register for domains, so like, github.com or whatever, and then that gets translated in IP address. With VPNs, there are ways to, oh, I found the chat, nice. There's ways to essentially tie in your DNS server to point to a VPN. So that way, like, you have a complete connection to a VPN, and that trust relationship doesn't depend on your ISP, which normally assigns you a DNS server to ask requests from. So yeah, in this case, you do have ways of hosting your own VPN that can then be, set up and host your own DNS server, and then use, modern secure DNS connections that some websites will support, like, HTTPS over DNS over HTTPS, which is a new thing that I think some Mozilla folks are working on. So there's ways to do that as well. We have a guide on how to choose a VPN from a while ago that is pretty popular. There's other ones out there. Wirecutter has a really great guide by my friend Yal Grauer. But essentially this talks about, where it comes down to what things to look for in terms of text specification, what things to look out for in terms of like limitations built into the OS, and what things to look out for in terms of like other leaks of, connections that could happen that are not protected by that VPN protocol. So for example, DNS isn't built in by that by default, same thing with IPv6. So being able to look at, DNS providers that will basically have ways to, on the client software, either through help files and manuals or through pre-built apps, essentially like lock down those potential avenues for leakage. Again, this is kind of what the short list ended up being. And this gets looked at every like 6 months or so.
Great. And then the last question was, what are your thoughts on anonymous or hacktivism in general?
I think a lot of it's been co-opted by nation states, frankly. And this is, again, this is just more of a not necessarily like fully, like I don't do a lot of deep research into this, but like the way people have done attribution in the past is like, we have, this categorization of what are called APTs or advanced persistent threats. So they are split up into basically what are believed to be nation state actors, like Russia, like the US, like China, like Iran. And, there are like hacking groups, like the Equation Group, which has a very 9 to 5, suspiciously 9 to 5 Monday through Friday schedule for, Maryland. Then you have, I think Fuzzy Bear and Fancy Bear, something Bear, that is kind of attributed to Russia, and also has like this very suspiciously like time zone driven schedule to be like, oh, this is what this time is, working hours in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And some of these groups try to pose as being like, oh, this hacking group found this like thing, but then turn out to like maybe be like actually deeply influenced, if not getting their marching orders from a nation state actor. So anonymous is like a million different things to different people. So it depends on who you're talking about. You know, their history in the like late aughts is one where, you know, they were essentially found by the FBI, and one of their members was turned as an informant by, you know, the FBI. So it's kind of dicey. Like, I don't like, it's interesting. Like, it's also interesting seeing like what the limitations or the boundaries of the hacktivism is in some areas. Like, in many cases, anonymous used to be very much into DDoS attacks and taking websites down, but that kind of attack in the modern age is really hard because of things actually like DIN, which did get taken down by the Miri botnet. But things that kind of Cloudflare, for example, which sit in between you and the website infrastructure that you're protecting, do mitigate against DDoS attacks a lot. So there's not really a lot of stuff happening there. So there's like a lot of like tweeting and kind of fun pranky stuff, but not like serious business. Like, you know, we breached the passwords of everybody at the CIA or whatever. So they're interesting. I don't know. Like, I don't really have a strong opinion in them. Activism is takes many forms. In many cases, like, people see a lot of the internet freedom work that we do kind of adjacent to FPF, things like working on Tor, working on Uni and all these other things as a kind of hacktivism. So yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering our fellows' questions today. Getting a lot of thank yous and great talks in the chat there. So great information and very helpful. So definitely, yeah, very informative and fun. So that's really great. Well, thank you so much for your help today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Cool. You too.
Bye.
Thanks, y'all.